man who'd wrestled bears and stared down blizzards. A man named Silas Brackett ordered himself a young bride. He paid good money for a woman strong enough for the mountains, with hands that could knead dough and a spirit that could birth sons. He dreamed of raven hair and a quick smile. But when the stagecoach door creaked open, a 60-year-old grandmother stepped off the wagon. Dust swirled around her worn black boots. One hand gripped a wooden cane, the other a worn leather satchel. Her hair was the color of winter frost, and the lines on her face told stories Silas had no interest in reading. The crowd on the platform, folks who'd known Silas for years, started with a snicker. It was a low, mean sound that grew into a full-throated laugh. The mountain man, the toughest trapper in the territory, had been made a fool. His face burned hotter than a branding iron. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. He stormed toward the stagecoach driver, his fists clenched. "Where's the rest of them?" he growled. "Where's the girl I sent for?" The driver just shrugged. "Just the one passenger for Silver Bluff, a Mrs. Eleanor Whittam." The old woman turned, her eyes clear and steady as a mountain lake. They didn't waver, not even as the laughter washed over her. "I am Eleanor Whittam," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "And you, I presume, are Mr. Silas Brackett." Before Silas could even form a protest, she opened her satchel. She pulled out a folded paper, crisp and official. "I have the marriage contract right here," she announced, her voice cutting through the mockery. "Signed and notarized in Denver. Everything is quite in order." The laughter died in an instant, replaced by a stunned, hungry silence. Silas stared at the paper, then at her. This wasn't a mistake. This was a trap. But the real shock wasn't the marriage license. It was the second document she pulled from that bag. It was a land deed. Old, weathered, but sealed by the territorial government. "And this," Eleanor Whittam said, her voice dropping just a little, "is my title to the 80 acres surrounding Brackett Springs." She tapped a specific point on the map. The spring. His spring. The only reliable source of fresh water for 10 miles. The lifeblood of his entire trapping operation. This woman hadn't just come to be his wife. She'd come to own him. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The whole town was watching, their earlier mockery replaced by a greedy, fascinated silence. This was better than a public hanging. This was the humbling of Silas Brackett. "Order?" He finally managed to choke out, the word tasting like ash. "There's nothing in order about this. I wrote the Matrimonial Times agency myself. I asked for a young woman, strong, able to bear children. Age was not stipulated in the final contract you signed," Eleanor said calmly, as if discussing the weather. She folded the deed and tucked it away, but left the marriage contract in her hand, a weapon held at the ready. "The agency matches clients based on stated requirements. You asked for a person of good character, Christian values, and practical skills. I possess all three." "Looks like you got yourself a grandma instead of a bride, Brackett," someone yelled from the back, and the laughter erupted again, harsher this time. "I have experience running a large household," Eleanor continued, her voice never wavering, speaking directly to Silas as if the crowd wasn't there. "I can nurse the sick, manage accounts, sew, cook, and tend a garden. I also speak English and Ute." The mention of the Ute language sent a fresh ripple through the crowd. Whispers replaced the laughter. Dealing with the Ute was a touchy business. Respectful avoidance was the town's policy. Speaking their tongue was something else entirely. It was strange, unsettling. "I won't be made a fool of," Silas snarled, turning to the stagecoach driver. "Pete, you get her back on that stage. Now." Old Pete just shook his head, already unlashing her trunk from the roof. "Stage don't head back east till Thursday, Silas, and her ticket's one way." Eleanor stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She barely came up to his shoulder, but the way she held herself, straight and unbent, made her seem taller. "Mr. Brackett, I have traveled over 1,000 miles to fulfill this contract. I have sold my home in the East. I have nowhere else to go. I intend to honor my commitment." Her eyes bore into his. "The question is, will you honor yours?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned to Pete. "Would you be so kind as to have my trunk delivered to Mrs. Miller's boarding house? I'll be taking a room there." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, tipping his hat. With a final, polite nod to the still gaping crowd, Eleanor Whittam made her way down the street, her cane tapping a steady, defiant rhythm on the wooden sidewalk. Her back was ramrod straight. Her head was high. She showed no sign that the whispers and stares bothered her at all. Silas stood frozen on the platform, his world crumbling around him. He was the talk of the town, a joke, and he was somehow married to a silver-haired stranger who now owned the very water he drank. Sheriff Wade clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Well, Brackett," the lawman drawled, a grin splitting his face. "Reckon this ain't quite what you had in mind." "Shut up," Silas growled, shrugging off the hand. He stalked away from the depot, the sound of laughter following him like a pack of coyotes. He ducked into the saloon, the smell of stale beer and sawdust a welcome relief. He needed a drink. He needed to think. Through the saloon's grimy window, he watched Eleanor make her way to the boarding house. She never faltered. There was something regal about her, he had to admit. But it didn't matter. She wasn't what he wanted. She was a disaster. "Whiskey," he told the bartender. "Leave the bottle." As he poured, his mind raced. The contract, the deed, her knowledge of the Ute language. This wasn't a random mix-up. This was a plan. It was all too perfect, too precise. But why? Who was this woman? And what did she really want with a broken-down trapper in the middle of nowhere? He knocked back the whiskey, but the burning in his throat was nothing compared to the fire in his gut. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He was going to find out what game she was playing, and then he was going to end it. The next morning, Silas was outside the telegraph office before the sun had even cleared the mountains. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night nursing the whiskey bottle, his anger hardening into a cold, sharp resolve. This marriage, this land grab, it was all going to end today. As he waited, the door to the boarding house opened. Eleanor emerged, looking as fresh as the morning dew. She saw him standing there and gave a slight formal nod before turning her steps toward the small white church at the end of the street. The whole town seemed to stop and watch her go. Miners on their way to the claims nudged each other. Women sweeping their porches paused to stare. Her name was already on everyone's lips, tangled up with his. Mrs. Brackett. They said it with a smirk, a private joke shared at his expense. The telegraph office finally opened, and Silas pushed inside, ready to send a blistering message to the matrimonial agency. But he stopped short. Pastor Jonas Bellamy was already there, his face etched with concern. "Ah, Mr. Brackett," the pastor said, his voice soft but firm. "I was just speaking with the operator. I'm afraid I have some news regarding your situation." "There's no situation," Silas grunted. "Just a mistake I aim to fix." "It's not that simple." Pastor Bellamy shook his head slowly. "The agency's representative in Denver telegraphed me this morning. They confirmed everything. The contract you signed gave them power of attorney. When Mrs. Whittam signed her portion, it became legally and spiritually binding in the eyes of the law and the church." The floor seemed to drop out from under Silas's feet. "What? That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is. You are, for all intents and purposes, a married man." "No!" Silas slammed his fist on the counter, making the telegraph key jump. "They tricked me. It's fraud." "Lower your voice, please," the pastor said, his tone unwavering. "Whatever the circumstances, the woman who arrived in this town is your lawful wife. Christian decency demands you provide her with shelter and support." "Christian decency?" Silas let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "I paid for a partner, not a—" "A what, Mr. Brackett?" Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. She stood there, calm and composed, her prayer book in one hand, her cane in the other. "A burden? A grandmother? Yes, I am that. I am also the woman who answered your advertisement in good faith." She stepped into the small office, her presence seeming to shrink the room. "Pastor, I assume you've explained the legalities." "I have, Mrs. Brackett," the pastor said, looking relieved to have an ally. Silas felt trapped. He was cornered by the law, the church, and this strangely unshakable old woman. There has to be a way to undo this. An annulment. A divorce. Pastor Bellamy looked pained. "That would require proving misconduct or fraud. Since age was not stipulated in your contract, and Mrs. Whittam was truthful about her practical skills, There are no grounds. It would be a messy public affair and likely unsuccessful. The word public hung in the air. More humiliation, more mockery. Silas could feel the walls closing in. Mr. Brackett, Eleanor said, her tone suddenly practical. There is no point in us lingering in town, providing fodder for gossip. The damage is done. The only sensible course of action is to proceed to your cabin. I am, as I stated, quite capable of managing a mountain life. Her sheer audacity stunned him. She wasn't begging or crying. She was managing him. She was telling him what to do. My cabin is no place for a woman your age, he managed, but the words lacked their earlier fire. I have lived in far worse, she replied dismissively. The Ute winter camps are not known for their comfort, I assure you. Another casual mention of the Ute. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. How did she know about their winter camps? The question flashed in his mind but was quickly replaced by a more pressing reality. She was right about the town. Staying here was unbearable. At least in the mountains, there were no prying eyes. At least in the mountains, he could think. Fine, he bit out, the word tasting like defeat. We'll leave tomorrow. Excellent, she said with a crisp nod. I have a few letters to write. Perhaps you could join me for supper at the boarding house this evening? We should discuss what provisions we'll need for the winter. Before he could refuse, she had turned and left, her cane tapping out a steady rhythm of victory on the floorboards. Give her a chance, Silas, Pastor Bellamy urged quietly. She is a child of God, just as you are. Her spirit seems formidable. Silas didn't answer. He stormed out of the office, his unwritten telegram forgotten. He was married, he was trapped, and he was about to bring the architect of his own ruin home. That night at the boarding house was torture. Every eye was on them. Eleanor, however, seemed oblivious. She chatted politely about her journey, her words painting vivid pictures of the landscape. She mentioned a fascinating conversation she'd had on the stagecoach with a Ute elder about medicinal plants. You speak Ute? One of the miners asked, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. Only a little, she said modestly. My late husband was a cavalry officer stationed in this territory many years ago. He worked with the tribal council on treaty negotiations. I learned enough to be useful. A cavalry officer, another piece. Silas filed it away. He listened in spite of himself. She wasn't just talking. She was observing. She asked him pointed questions about his trapping grounds, the patterns of the elk herds, the depth of the winter snows. Her interest wasn't idle. It was strategic. After the meal, she handed him a list of supplies she'd written. It was practical, sensible, and showed a keen understanding of what it took to survive a mountain winter. Nothing frivolous. Basic medicines, extra salt, flour, beans, and curiously, a large quantity of apple seeds. Apple seeds? He asked, his suspicion rising again. An investment in the future, she said with a faint smile. Every home should have an apple tree. He agreed to the list, feeling more like an employee than a husband. As he left the boarding house, the whispers followed him. He wasn't just Silas Brackett, the mountain man anymore. He was the man who'd been outsmarted by a grandmother. Back in his cabin, alone with the flickering lamplight, a new, colder fear began to creep in. Her knowledge of the Ute, her husband being a cavalry officer involved in treaties, her deed to his land, her questions about his operations. This wasn't just about a marriage contract. This was bigger. It was about the land. It was about the past. And he had a terrible feeling that he was just a pawn in a game that had started long before she ever stepped off that stagecoach. The 2-day ride to his cabin was a silent, tense affair. Eleanor rode with a straight back, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape. She wasn't looking at it like a newcomer, but like someone searching for landmarks, for things she recognized. It was unsettling. Silas pointed his cabin out from a distance, a small, sturdy structure of smoke-stained logs, backed by a wall of towering pines. It wasn't much, but it was his, a place of solitude and silence. When they arrived, he expected a complaint, a gasp of dismay at the rough-hewn table, the single cot, the dirt floor. Instead, she slid from her horse, her movement stiff but sure, and ran a gloved hand along the chinked logs. Solid construction, she said, her voice betraying a hint of approval. Good, tight corners. This will hold the heat. While he tended to the horses, she went inside. By the time he returned, a fire was already crackling in the hearth, chasing the chill from the stone. She had unpacked one of her bags and was wiping down the single shelf with a damp cloth. The cabin, which had always felt like his private den, suddenly felt occupied, invaded. That night was the strangest of his life. He lay on his bedroll on the floor while she took the cot. He could hear the soft whisper of her breathing, a foreign sound in the familiar symphony of the mountain night. The wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the rush of the creek, and now this, the quiet, steady breath of the woman who had taken over his life. The next morning he woke to the smell of coffee. She was already up, moving about the cabin with quiet efficiency. As he pulled on his boots, he saw it. Her large traveling trunk sat open by the hearth. Inside were neatly folded clothes, linens, and bundles of papers tied with faded ribbon. Mr. Brackett, she said without turning around, there is something we must discuss. His stomach tightened. He sat at the rough table as she brought 2 cups of coffee. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she reached into the trunk and pulled out the papers. She laid them on the table between them. One was the deed she had shown him in town. The other was a map. A detailed survey map, drawn in a precise professional hand. It showed the entire valley, the creek, the ridges, and it was marked with strange symbols, notations he didn't understand. My late husband, James, was a surveyor for the territorial government, she began, her voice low and serious. He mapped this entire region for the army back in the 40s. Before the settlers, before the miners, before you. She traced a line on the map with her finger. It followed the creek, his creek, up into the higher elevations. When he filed the claim, she continued, it wasn't just for the water. She paused, taking a sip of coffee, her eyes holding his over the rim of the cup. Silas, she said, using his given name for the first time, the spring that feeds this creek originates in a series of caves. According to my husband's geological notes, those caves are laced with one of the richest veins of silver in this territory. The tin cup fell from his hand, clattering onto the floor, splashing hot coffee across his boots. He barely felt it. Silver. He'd spent 15 years trapping furs for pennies on the dollar, living hand to mouth, while he was sitting on a fortune she now legally owned. You planned this, he accused, his voice a raw whisper. The marriage, all of it. You knew. No, she said, her calm unwavering. I only found these papers a few weeks before I answered your advertisement. I knew the deed was valuable, but I didn't know precisely where it was located. I didn't know your cabin was on it until we arrived yesterday. Mighty convenient, he snarled, jumping to his feet. He paced the small cabin like a caged wolf. You trick your way into my life, and now you tell me you own everything. I am telling you now, she said, her spine stiffening, because there is another party who is also aware of this map. Silas froze. What are you talking about? My husband did not work alone. He had a partner, a younger, ambitious officer who helped him with the surveys. A man who, I believe, murdered my husband to get these maps for himself. He never found them. I hid them after James's death. She leaned forward, her eyes burning with an intensity he had never seen before. He is a powerful man now, a railroad man, and I have reason to believe he is finally closing in on this valley. She tapped the map. His name is Darius Kellerman. The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Kellerman, the slick railroad agent he'd seen in town just a few days ago, the one who was buying up claims and promising progress. He hadn't just been sniffing around. He'd been hunting, and Eleanor hadn't come here to steal his land. She'd come here seeking a sanctuary or a soldier. The cabin felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the weight of her revelation. Kellerman, murder, a hidden silver mine. Silas's world, which had been upended just 2 days ago, had now been shattered into a million pieces. Why me? He finally asked, his voice hoarse. Out of all the men in this territory, why answer my advertisement? Eleanor folded her hands on the table, her gaze direct. Because your advertisement described an isolated man, a man with no deep roots in the town, who knew the mountains, who could survive on his own. You were, for lack of a better word, defensible. I needed a husband, legally, to strengthen my claim to this land. A partnership. I did not, however, anticipate that your cabin would be sitting directly on top of the prize. It made a twisted kind of sense. She hadn't chosen him. She had chosen his location, his isolation. He was a piece on her chessboard. So what now? He asked, slumping back into his chair. We wait for this Kellerman to show up with the whole damn railroad behind him? He will not come with an army, she said. Not at first. Men like Kellerman prefer to work in the shadows. He will try to pressure us, to buy us out, to frighten us. When that fails, he will resort to other methods. The methods he used on my husband. The unspoken word hung between them. Murder. For the first time, Silas looked at this old woman and saw not a burden, but a survivor. She had been living with this secret, this danger, for years. She had crossed a continent, married a stranger, and walked into the heart of the wilderness, all to protect her legacy and perhaps to find justice. A strange, unfamiliar feeling began to stir in his chest. It wasn't pity, it was a grudging respect. Over the next few days, a peculiar rhythm established itself. Silas went about his trapping, but his senses were heightened. Every snapping twig, every distant bird call sounded like a threat. He wasn't just hunting beaver anymore. He was patrolling his territory, watching for any sign of intruders. Eleanor, for her part, transformed the cabin. She hung simple muslin curtains. She organized his meager supplies. She baked bread, the warm, yeasty smell a comforting counterpoint to the tension that crackled between them. She never spoke of the silver or Kellerman again, but it was always there, an invisible guest at their silent meals. One morning he came back from his trap line to see 3 Ute women standing outside his cabin. They weren't armed, just carrying baskets for gathering. But the sight of strangers made his hand drop to the knife on his belt. Before he could say a word, Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. She raised a hand in greeting and spoke, not in English, but in the flowing, tonal language of the Ute. Silas watched, stunned, as a conversation unfolded. It was slow, halting at times, but it was real. The Ute women, who normally treated white settlers with a deep, weary suspicion, began to relax. They smiled. One of the women offered Eleanor a bundle of dried herbs from her basket. Eleanor, in turn, went inside and came back with a small sack of flour. A trade. A peaceful, respectful trade, happening right on his doorstep. When the women left, they nodded to him, a gesture of acknowledgement he had never received before. How did you learn to speak it so well? He asked, his suspicion warring with a new curiosity. I told you my husband worked on the treaties, she said, busying herself with the herbs. But James was not an honest negotiator. He made promises to the Ute that he never intended to keep. Promises about hunting grounds, about sacred lands. Her hand stilled. There was a misunderstanding, an escalation. The cavalry was called in. It was a massacre, Silas. Women, children, they were slaughtered because of my husband's lies. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a grief so old and deep it seemed to have carved the lines on her face. I have spent 20 years trying to atone for his sins. I sent money, medicine, supplies, anything I could, through intermediaries. Learning their language, offering what little respect I could, was part of that atonement. Now he understood. Her connection to the Ute wasn't just a practical skill, it was a penance, a secret she had carried for decades. That night, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft, silent flakes that quickly blanketed the world in white. They sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer hostile, but filled with the weight of their shared secrets. Suddenly, a sharp, frantic knocking echoed at the door. Silas grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding. He cracked the door open. A young Ute boy, no older than 10, stood shivering on the porch, his face pale with fear. He spoke in a rush of panicked words, pointing back down the trail. Eleanor was at his side in an instant. She listened, her face growing grim. What is it? Silas demanded. His mother, she said, her voice tight. She was checking her traps near the river when the snow started. She slipped and fell. Her leg is broken. They can't move her. The river is a half-day's ride in good weather, Silas said. In this blizzard, it's suicide. We can't leave her there to die, Eleanor said, already pulling on her thickest cloak. Get the horses and bring the medical kit, the one with the splints. Silas stared at her. She was proposing they ride into the teeth of a blizzard, into the dead of night, to save a woman she barely knew. It was insane. But as he looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, he knew he couldn't refuse. This was who she was. This was what she did. She built bridges. She healed wounds. She atoned. He grabbed his coat and his rifle. I'll need the lantern, he said, and all the rope we have. For the second time in his life, he was following this impossible woman into a storm, with no idea if either of them would come out alive. The blizzard was a roaring white monster. Wind screamed through the pines, tearing at their clothes and driving snow into their faces with the force of sand. The lantern cast a pathetic, flickering circle of light that was swallowed by the swirling darkness just a few feet ahead. Silas led the way, his horse struggling through drifts that were already knee-deep. Eleanor followed, a grim, silent shadow behind him. Every instinct screamed at Silas to turn back. This was a fool's errand. The cold was a physical thing, sinking its teeth into his bones. But every time he glanced back, he saw her, upright in the saddle, her face set, and he pushed onward. After what felt like an eternity, the Ute boy led them to a rocky overhang near the frozen river. A small fire sputtered against the wind. The injured woman lay beside it, her face beaded with sweat despite the freezing cold. Her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Her husband and another man were trying desperately to keep her warm. They looked up as Silas and Eleanor arrived, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. Eleanor slid from her horse and went to the woman's side immediately, ignoring the cold and the wind. She spoke to her in soft, reassuring Ute, her hands gently examining the injury. It's a clean break, she announced, her voice calm and authoritative amidst the chaos of the storm. But we need to set it now, before the swelling gets worse. For the next hour, Silas watched in awe. This 60-year-old grandmother, in the middle of a blizzard, became a field surgeon. She directed the men with a quiet confidence that demanded obedience. She had Silas rig a rope to a tree branch to create traction. She showed the woman's husband how to hold her steady. Then, with a deep breath, she took the leg in her own two hands and, with a swift, powerful movement, set the bone. The woman screamed, a raw, piercing sound that was snatched away by the wind. But then it was done. Eleanor, her face beaded with sweat, worked quickly to splint the leg, using branches and strips of cloth from her own petticoat. She brewed a tea from the herbs she'd gotten from the Ute women, a powerful painkiller that soon had the injured woman drifting into a fitful sleep. They huddled under the overhang for the rest of the night, sharing body heat against the relentless cold. The storm finally broke with the dawn, leaving a world of pristine, deadly white. The journey back was slow and treacherous. They fashioned a litter to carry the woman, taking turns guiding the horses through the deep snow. When they finally reached the Ute camp, they were met with a reception that left Silas speechless. The entire village came out. They didn't cheer or shout. They stood in silence, their faces filled with a profound, solemn gratitude. The woman's husband grasped Silas's hand, then Eleanor's, and simply said a Ute word she later told him meant family. As they rode away from the camp, Eleanor swayed in the saddle, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. Silas rode up beside her, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "You're a wonder, Eleanor," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. It was the first time he'd said her name with genuine admiration. She gave him a tired smile. Just a woman doing what needs to be done. When they got back to the cabin, Silas helped her down from the horse. For a moment she leaned on him, her small frame trembling with fatigue. In that moment, she wasn't the formidable schemer or the mysterious landowner. She was just a tired old woman who had risked her life for a stranger. And he, Silas Brackett, the solitary mountain man, had risked his right alongside her. Something had shifted between them in the heart of that storm. The invisible walls of suspicion and resentment had been battered down by the shared ordeal. A week later, as the snow began to melt under a warm spring sun, a rider approached the cabin. It wasn't a Ute hunter or a lost miner. The man was dressed in a fine Eastern suit, his boots polished to a high shine. He rode a sleek bay horse that looked out of place in the rugged landscape. He dismounted and smiled a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Whittam," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. "It has been a long time." He tipped his hat. "I am Darius Kellerman, and I've come to collect what is mine." The game was finally on. Silas stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester held loosely at his side. He didn't point it, but the message was clear. He stood beside Eleanor, a silent, solid presence. Kellerman's gaze flickered over Silas, dismissing him as little more than a piece of furniture. His focus was entirely on Eleanor. "You've led me on quite a chase, my dear," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "All these years I thought the maps were lost in the fire, but you were always cleverer than James." "The fire you set, Darius?" Eleanor's voice was ice. "The one that was meant to kill me too?" Kellerman just shrugged, a small, elegant gesture of indifference. "Unfortunate business, but the past is the past. I am here to make you a generous offer. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad has a vested interest in this valley. We are prepared to buy your claim. Name your price. A comfortable retirement back east, perhaps." "This land is not for sale," Eleanor stated flatly. "Everything is for sale," Kellerman corrected. "It's simply a matter of finding the right currency. Perhaps your husband would be more reasonable. A man like him could do very well with the kind of money I'm offering." He turned his attention to Silas. "What about it, Brackett? $100,000 in gold, enough to set you up like a king." It was a staggering sum, more money than Silas could ever dream of. He could leave this place, find a real bride, build a real life. For a fleeting second he was tempted. Then he looked at Eleanor. He saw the strength in her tired face, the unbending will. He remembered her in the blizzard, setting a bone with her bare hands. He remembered the look of gratitude on the faces of the Ute. This wasn't just about land or silver. It was about honor. "My wife said the land isn't for sale," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "That's the only answer you're getting." Kellerman's smile finally vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "I see she's filled your head with her sentimental nonsense. Very well, have it your way." He swung back onto his horse. "But know this, the railroad is coming through this valley. Progress cannot be stopped by a stubborn old woman and her backwoods pet. I gave you the easy way. Now you'll learn the hard way." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a tense silence in his wake. "He'll be back," Silas said, stating the obvious. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "and he won't be alone." The hard way began 2 days later. Silas rode into Silver Bluff for supplies and found the town transformed. Kellerman had been busy. The saloon was buzzing with talk of the railroad, jobs, money, prosperity. Kellerman was buying drinks for everyone, promising them a golden future, and he was painting Silas and Eleanor as the villains. "Can you believe it?" Tom Henderson, the depot manager, said loudly as Silas walked in. "That old woman and Brackett are sitting on the key to this whole town's future, and they won't sell. Selfish is what it is." "Heard she's in with the Utes," another man slurred, "probably promising them the land. An Indian lover, that's what she is." The poison spread quickly. Friends who used to greet him now looked away. The store owner overcharged him. Sheriff Wade watched him with cold, narrowed eyes. Kellerman had bought the town's loyalty, and Silas and Eleanor were the price. The ride home was heavy with dread. When he told Eleanor what had happened, she just nodded slowly. "This is how he works," she said. "He turns neighbor against neighbor. He isolates his target. This is what he did to the Ute. He promised the settlers land, and then he sent the cavalry to clear it." That night Silas was cleaning his rifle when Eleanor came and sat across from him. "Silas," she said quietly, "you don't have to be a part of this. Kellerman's offer is still on the table. You could take the money and walk away. No one would blame you." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He saw the genuine offer in her eyes, the willingness to sacrifice herself to save him. "When I was a boy," he said slowly, "my father lost our farm to a slick talker from the bank. The whole town turned on him, said he was a fool. We left in the middle of the night, shamed. I swore I'd never let anyone run me off my own land again. He met her gaze. This is my land, Eleanor. And you are my wife. The word didn't feel strange anymore. It felt right. We're in this together, he said. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. All right then, Silas Brackett, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Let's show Mr. Kellerman what mountain folk are made of. The first attack came a week later. Silas was checking his upper trap line on Eagle Ridge when he saw the smoke. He rode hard, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His line shack, the small shelter where he stored his winter supplies, was an inferno. The flames leaped high into the sky, a pillar of black smoke marking the spot. By the time he got there, it was too late. The shack was collapsing into a pile of smoldering embers. His winter food, his extra traps, his ammunition, all gone. It was a message. We can get to you. We can destroy you. As he stood there watching his livelihood turn to ash, a cold, hard rage settled in his soul. This was no longer a battle of words or money. Kellerman had declared war. Silas rode back to the cabin, not with fear, but with a chilling sense of clarity. The easy way was over. The hard way had begun, and the hard way was the only way Silas Brackett knew how to fight. When Silas returned to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, painting the mountains in hues of blood and bruised purple. The smell of smoke still clung to his clothes. Eleanor met him on the porch, her face pale. She had seen the smoke from miles away. It's gone, he said, the words flat and dead. Everything. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just placed a hand on his arm. Come inside. I've kept supper warm. That night they ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the quiet of two soldiers before a battle, each lost in their own thoughts, gathering their strength for what was to come. The next morning, Eleanor made a decision. I am going to ride to the Ute camp, she announced. Silas looked up from sharpening his knife. That's not safe. Kellerman's men could be anywhere. It's precisely because it's not safe that I must go, she countered. Kellerman's strategy is to isolate us. Our only hope is to form an alliance. Chief Nakai and his people know this land better than anyone. They know Kellerman's lies better than anyone. They are our only potential allies. He knew she was right. They couldn't fight this alone. I'll go with you, he said. No, she said firmly. You need to stay here. Guard the cabin. Guard our claim. They will be watching. If we both leave, they'll burn this place down too. I will be safe. The Ute consider me family. They will protect me. He argued, but her logic was unshakable. Reluctantly, he helped her saddle her horse. As she prepared to leave, she pressed a small leather-bound book into his hands. It was her personal journal. If something happens to me, she said, her voice low, everything you need to know is in here. The original survey notes, a copy of my husband's confession about the treaties, names of witnesses. It's the proof, Silas. The proof that can ruin Kellerman. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She gave him a sad smile. Plan with hope, Silas, but prepare for the worst. He watched her ride away, a small, determined figure disappearing into the vast wilderness. The cabin had never felt so empty, so quiet. He was alone, waiting for a war to start, his only companion, the journal full of secrets that could get them both killed. He spent the next 2 days in a state of hypervigilance. He barely slept. He patrolled the perimeter of the cabin, rifle in hand, checking and rechecking the shadows. The silence of the mountains was no longer a comfort, it was a threat. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent his heart racing. On the 3rd day he saw them, 4 riders on the ridge overlooking the cabin. They weren't trying to hide. They sat on their horses, motionless silhouettes against the sky, just watching. It was a classic intimidation tactic. We are here. We see you. You are alone. Silas didn't flinch. He brought his own rifle out onto the porch and sat in his rocking chair, cleaning the weapon in plain sight. It was his own message back to them. I am here. I see you. And I am ready. That night he opened Eleanor's journal. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a stark contrast to the grim story it told. It detailed her husband's descent into greed, his betrayal of the Ute, and his partnership with a young, ruthless Darius Kellerman. It spoke of Kellerman's obsession with the silver, his threats, and the accidental fire that killed James and nearly took Eleanor too. But there was another secret hidden in the pages, a secret even more explosive than the silver. According to her husband's notes, the main vein of silver was located in a cave system that was not just on Ute land, but was considered their most sacred site, the Cave of the Spirits, where their ancestors were buried. Mining it wouldn't just be theft. It would be a profound act of desecration, an act that could unite every tribe in the territory and start an all-out war. Now Silas understood Eleanor's desperation. She wasn't just protecting her inheritance, she was trying to prevent a bloodbath. Just as he finished reading, he heard it, the faint but unmistakable sound of hoofbeats coming fast. Not from the direction of the Ute camp, from the direction of town. He grabbed his rifle and burst out the door. It was a full-blown posse, at least 15 men, carrying torches that cut fiery sways through the darkness. They were being led by Sheriff Wade. "Silas Brackett," the sheriff yelled, his voice carrying in the night air. "You're under arrest." "Arrest? For what?" Silas shouted back, leveling his rifle. "For the murder of your wife, Eleanor Brackett," Wade declared. "We found her horse wandering riderless down by the river, and we have a witness who says he saw you two arguing violently just before she rode out." Silas's blood ran cold. It was a frame-up, a perfect, vicious trap. They hadn't just taken Eleanor. They were going to see him hang for it. The mob spurred their horses, charging toward the cabin, their torches held high, their faces twisted into masks of righteous fury. Silas stood his ground, his back against the wall, the damning journal clutched in one hand, the rifle in the other. He was out of time, out of allies, and out of options. The war had come home. The mob surrounded the cabin, their torches casting wild, dancing shadows that made the familiar pines look like monstrous claws. "Give it up, Brackett," Sheriff Wade shouted. "Don't make this uglier than it has to be." Silas's mind raced. They had Eleanor. They had a witness, no doubt one of Kellerman's hired guns. They had the town's fury on their side. If he started shooting, they'd burn him out and call it justice. If he surrendered, they'd drag him back to town and have him swinging from a rope by morning. He was trapped. But then he remembered her words, the proof that can ruin Kellerman. He held up the journal. "You want me, Wade? You'll have to come and get me. But this book tells a different story. It tells the truth about Kellerman." "He's stalling," someone yelled. "He killed that poor old woman." "Did he?" a new voice called out, sharp and clear from the edge of the woods. The mob turned. Stepping out of the darkness, flanked by 10 of his best warriors, was Chief Nakai. His face was like carved granite in the torchlight, and beside him, pale and exhausted, but very much alive, was Eleanor. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Sheriff Wade's jaw dropped. "My wife seems to have a habit of turning up when people least expect her," Silas said, a slow, dangerous grin spreading across his face. Eleanor walked forward, her Ute escort parting to let her pass. She looked at the shocked faces of the townsmen, her gaze lingering on the sheriff. "It seems reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Sheriff," she said, her voice laced with steel. "Though not for a lack of trying on the part of Mr. Kellerman's men, they ambushed me on the trail. Fortunately, my friends arrived before they could finish the job." Chief Nakai stepped forward. "We found this man," he said, and 2 of his warriors dragged a struggling, gagged figure into the light. It was one of the men Silas had seen on the ridge. "He was very talkative," Nakai added with a grim smile. "He told us everything, how Kellerman hired him to get rid of Mrs. Brackett and frame her husband." The crowd began to mutter, the certainty on their faces curdling into confusion and doubt. They looked from the captured gunman to Sheriff Wade, whose face was turning a blotchy red. This is a trick," Wade stammered. "You can't trust the word of a savage against a white man." "Perhaps not," Silas said, stepping down from the porch, holding the journal open. "But can you trust the word of a dead man?" He began to read. He read James Whittam's confession aloud, about the broken treaties, the massacre, the partnership with Kellerman. He read about the silver, and then he read about the sacred burial ground. A horrified silence fell over the posse. These were God-fearing men, most of them. They understood greed. They understood violence. But desecrating a cemetery, a holy place, that was a line many of them were not willing to cross. "He's been playing all of you for fools," Eleanor's voice rang out, filled with righteous anger. "He promised you prosperity, but his plan would have brought a war to your doorsteps, a war that would have burned this entire valley to the ground." The tide was turning. Men who had been shouting for Silas's blood now turned their angry eyes toward the sheriff. "You knew about this, Wade?" one of them asked. "You were in on it with him." The sheriff, seeing the game was up, made a desperate move. He drew his pistol and grabbed Eleanor, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "Stay back, all of you!" But he had underestimated Silas. The mountain man moved with a speed that belied his size. He threw the heavy journal, striking Wade's gun hand. The pistol flew into the dirt. In the same instant, Silas lunged, tackling the sheriff and driving him to the ground. It was over in seconds. Nikai's warriors secured Wade, tying his hands with his own rope. The posse stood in stunned silence, their torches illuminating the strange, victorious tableau. The mountain man and the grandmother, standing side by side with the Ute chief, their faces grim but triumphant. They had faced down the mob, exposed the conspiracy, and won. But Silas knew it wasn't over yet. Kellerman was still out there. "Wade," Silas said, hauling the sheriff to his feet. "Where is he?" The sheriff, his face a mask of terror, just shook his head. "I don't know. He was heading for the caves. Said he was going to get what was his, with or without you." Eleanor's eyes widened in alarm. "The spring thaw," she breathed. "The high waters will have opened the lower entrance to the cave. He's going in alone to claim the silver before the railroad finds out he's been lying to them." Silas looked to Chief Nikai. The cave of the spirits. A dark, dangerous light entered the chief's eyes. "No one enters that place. No one." Silas grabbed his rifle. "He won't be coming out." He looked at Eleanor. This was it. The final move. "Stay here. Stay safe." "No," she said, her chin set in that familiar, stubborn line. "This started with my family. It will end with my family. I'm coming with you." Silas didn't have time to argue. He, Eleanor, and Chief Nikai, with his 5 best warriors, mounted up and rode hard for the caves, leaving the dazed and shamed posse to escort Sheriff Wade back to his own jail. The final chase was on, a desperate race against a man consumed by a decades-old greed, deep into the sacred heart of the mountain. They rode like the wind, the Ute warriors flowing over the terrain as if they were part of it. They reached the entrance to the caves, a dark, gaping maw in the mountainside slick with moss and the spray of the nearby waterfall, just as the last light of day was failing. 2 horses were tethered outside. Kellerman wasn't alone. "He brought help," Silas muttered, dismounting and checking his rifle. Chief Nikai held up a hand. "This is a sacred place. We will not dishonor it with loud noises and gunfire unless we must." He and his warriors seemed to melt into the shadows, their movements silent, their intentions deadly. Silas and Eleanor followed them into the cave. The air immediately grew cold and damp, smelling of wet rock and ancient earth. The only light came from a lantern Kellerman had left near the entrance, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed on the walls. The sound of rushing water echoed from deep within. They moved forward, their footsteps unnervingly loud in the echoing cavern. The main chamber opened up before them, a vast, subterranean cathedral. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by 2 more lanterns, were Kellerman and another man. They were standing before a fissure in the rock face, a crack that glittered and shone with a breathtaking, metallic light. The silver vein. It was real. It was richer than Silas could have ever imagined. Kellerman was laughing, a wild, unhinged sound that bounced off the cavern walls. "I knew it," he crowed, running his hands over the glittering rock. "After all these years, it's mine." "It belongs to no one, Darius," Eleanor's voice said, calm and clear in the vast space. Kellerman spun around, his face a mask of shock and rage. His partner drew a pistol. "Eleanor, how?" You underestimated my friends, she said, as Nakai and his warriors emerged from the shadows, surrounding the two men. Kellerman's eyes darted around, seeing he was trapped. The greed on his face was replaced by a rabid desperation. It doesn't matter. I'll kill all of you. This mine is mine. He lunged for Eleanor, but Silas was faster. He stepped between them, his big frame a solid wall. Your fight is with me, Kellerman. What happened next was a blur of chaos. Kellerman's man fired his pistol, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. One of Nikai's warriors grunted and fell. The others descended on the gunman, overpowering him in seconds. Kellerman, meanwhile, scrambled away not toward the exit, but deeper into the cave, toward the sound of rushing water. He's heading for the underground river, Silas yelled. He thinks he can find another way out. Silas plunged into the darkness after him, leaving Eleanor with Nakai and his men. The passage twisted and turned, sloping steeply downward. He could hear Kellerman scrambling ahead of him, his polished city boots slipping on the wet rock. He burst into another chamber, this one filled with a deafening roar. An underground river, swollen with snowmelt, churned through the cavern, a furious torrent of black water. Kellerman stood on a narrow ledge, looking for a way across. He was trapped. It's over, Kellerman, Silas shouted over the roar. Kellerman turned, his face contorted with hate. It's not over until I'm dead. He pulled a small derringer from his boot, but before he could fire, the ground began to shake. A deep, grinding rumble vibrated up through the soles of Silas's boots. The pistol shot from earlier had been the final straw for the unstable cavern. Rocks and dust began to rain down from the ceiling. The ledge Kellerman was standing on cracked. With a final scream of terror and disbelief, he was pitched into the raging river. The torrent swallowed him in an instant, pulling him down into the black heart of the mountain he had so desperately coveted. The cave was collapsing. Silas turned and ran, rocks crashing down around him. He scrambled back up the passage, dust choking him, the roar of the river replaced by the groan of the dying mountain. He burst back into the main chamber to find Nakai and his warriors dragging their wounded comrade toward the exit. Silas! Eleanor cried out in relief. The whole place is coming down? He yelled. We have to get out now. They scrambled for the entrance as the massive cavern behind them groaned its last. They burst out into the cool night air just as a final, deafening crash echoed from within the mountain. The entrance to the cave slumped inward, sealing itself with tons of rock. The silver was gone, buried forever. The sacred ground was safe, protected by the mountain itself. They stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the dust settling around them. The wounded warrior would live. Kellerman was gone. It was over. Eleanor walked over to Silas. In the pale moonlight, her face looked serene. You saved me, she said softly. We saved each other, he replied, his voice still raspy from the dust. Chief Nakai came and stood before them. He looked from the sealed cave entrance to Eleanor. The spirits are at peace, he said. Your husband's debt is paid. Grandmother who makes right. You have brought honor back to this valley. Eleanor bowed her head, tears of relief finally streaming down her face. As the sun rose the next morning, they rode back toward the cabin. The valley looked different, as if a great weight had been lifted from it. It felt clean, peaceful. When they reached the clearing, Silas helped Eleanor down from her horse. They stood there on the porch, watching the ute ride away, their duty done. So, Silas said, breaking the comfortable silence, what now? Eleanor looked at him, a small, hopeful smile playing on her lips. She gestured to the sack of apple seeds still sitting on the porch. Now, Mr. Brackett, she said, I believe we have an orchard to plant. The story of that day spread like wildfire. The shamed posse brought Sheriff Wade back in irons, and the captured gunman sang like a canary, implicating Kellerman, Wade, and a dozen other men. The railroad, fearing a massive scandal and a full-blown Indian war, quietly dropped its plans for the valley, paid a hefty restitution to the Ute, and rerouted their line 30 miles to the south. Life in Silver Bluff changed. The easy greed Kellerman had fostered was replaced by a hard-won respect. The townsfolk, humbled and grateful, started looking at their Ute neighbors differently. Small kindnesses began to flow back and forth. a sack of flour left for a Ute family, a finely woven blanket given to a settler's newborn. The bridges Eleanor had been building in secret for 20 years were now being walked upon in the bright light of day. At the cabin on Brackett Springs, an even greater transformation took place. Silas and Eleanor, the unlikely couple brought together by a lie, began to build a true partnership. They worked side by side, planting the apple seedlings in the rich bottomland. Ute children and settlers' kids often came to help, their laughter echoing in the valley. The deed to the land was officially redrawn, making them equal partners. But the paper was just a formality. Their real bond had been forged in blizzards and sealed in the heart of a collapsing mountain. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Silas took Eleanor's weathered hand in his. "That day you stepped off the stagecoach," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought my life was over. I thought you were the greatest shame, the greatest burden a man could ever have." He squeezed her hand. "I was a fool. You weren't a burden. You were a gift. My gift from God, sent to teach this stubborn, lonely man what honor and courage and love really mean." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, her silver hair catching the last golden rays of the sun. "And I came here seeking to atone for the sins of a dead man," she whispered. "Instead, I found a life with a good one." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. The apple trees, still just tiny saplings, stood in neat rows, their leaves whispering in the evening breeze. They were a promise, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful futures grow from the most unexpected seeds in the most unlikely soil. Thank you for listening to this story. It's a reminder that courage isn't about how you fight, but what you fight for, and that true wealth isn't buried in the ground, but lives in the connections we build with one another. If you enjoyed this story and you believe in second chances, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know when the next story might change your perspective. We'll see you tomorrow.